Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our study of Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche's desire. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to present this. Traleg Rinpoche had a lot of impact in terms of teaching in the modern world. So we're very fortunate to actually still have teachings of his that were recorded and that are then being published. So we're very grateful also to Traleg Kando, who's doing this. I realize there's quite a few. There's a few of I'm not exactly sure how many, but I know there are some of Traleg Rinpoche's direct students participating in this webinar, and I'd like to I don't know if we can call it a disclaimer, but I certainly won't pretend that what I'm presenting here is, you could say, completely in concordance with Traleg Rinpoche's wisdom and his wisdom intention. What you have here is it's a tribute to Traleg Rinpoche. It's an expression of my deep respect for him, and particularly this work that he's teaching. And what you're getting here is, of course, just aspects of the teachings that I'm noticing and that I'd like to share, that I think are significant. And as always with these webinars, from that perspective, really, that I couldn't really do ultimate justice to the subject matter, it's also very much a question of leading the horse to the water, in the sense of this will hopefully make many of you study this book. And I think the real value of this course is that we're getting together and we're looking at Traleg Rinpoche's words. Now, what we're doing here is this is really important, actually, because, of course, what we're studying here applies to all Buddhist teaching. And so it's not a method. Then again, there are often that we in the teachings here, well, you should let go of desire, you shouldn't have attachment. And without further substantiation, this sometimes leaves you wondering, well, how exactly are we supposed to do that? And how does it play out? And this is where it's really fortunate that we have a teaching like this from Traleg Rinpoche, because this is something that informs what we're doing. This is very much a work for practitioners. So there's a continually reference to a process of introspection. And that, of course, is how Buddhist science works. Buddhist science is empirical, but it works on observing the subject matter that we're observing is the mind. So everything that we're talking about here has to do with us actually being aware of what's happening within our mind. This obviously goes without saying, but at the same time, for the modern persons who very often think of science in terms of something we look at outside, and very often think of how to handle our mind and our life and our experience in terms of what we do. This is much more about attitude and about changing attitude behind what we're doing. So this goes beyond the behaviorist aspect of what am I supposed to do. This is more about changing the motivation and attitude behind. Also, for that reason, and this we also see in the Buddhist sutras as part of the Buddhist methodology, there's a lot of emphasis. There's a lot of what very often reflects the emphasis is that we go over the same thing again and again. Like we could say, well, the point here is that we're going to be looking at what is constructive desire, what is destructive desire. But the point needs to be made, and it's very much about us continually coming back to a place where we're identifying this process within ourselves. So that's just a few general comments here before we begin. I had the pleasure to meet Traleg Rinpoche just a few years before he passed away, and it was really a tremendous delight to meet Rinpoche. And so just very briefly on his life here, this is very much also just gleaned from Traleg Khandro's introduction. So Rinpoche was born in eastern Tibet in Nangchen. He was recognized by the 16th Karmapa, and he was enthroned as the supreme abbot of Tranghu Monastery. This is also the monastery where Kenshin Tranghu comes from, but actually Traleg Rinpoche was you could say, the head of the monastery, and Tranghu Rinpoche was then one of the teachers there. So Traleg Rinpoche studied with His Holiness the Karmapa in Rumtek when they came out of Tibet. He also studied with Venerable Tukse Rinpoche, the teacher of the Gyalwa Drukchen in Darjeeling. And then he went on to study at the Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in Sarnath and also the Sanskrit University in Varanasi. He was head of the Sangdopari Gompa in Eastern Bhutan. All of this actually in some quite young age, before he was 20. And then he was interpreter for His Holiness the Karmapa in Rumtek for a while. And that then led to invitations for him to come to Australia. He studied comparative religion and philosophy at La Trobe University in Melbourne, and he also founded then the Evam Institute in 1982. And Evam Institute is then still running and functioning according to Traleg Rinpoche's intention. Rinpoche lived and taught for 25 years in Australia, also traveling to New Zealand and America, where he founded centers. Rinpoche wrote books. He founded a magazine called Ordinary Mind, and also the publishing house Shogun. He established something called the Buddhist Summer School, which has been running from 1984 until the present day, and it runs both in Melbourne, generally at Matripa, and also over in Auckland. So Rinpoche passed away and passed into Nirvana on the day of the Chunko Duchen, which is when we celebrate when the Buddha taught first time. So this is about Traleg Rinpoche then. Yes, this is being recorded. Yeah, hopefully. Actually, I have a bit of a backup going here, so I think we'll be okay. So part one, the nature of desire. The ubiquitous nature of desire, meaning the universal and ever-present nature of desire. Now, as Buddhists, we are aiming for enlightenment. And that's, of course, our ultimate aim. But also, as just ordinary humans, we temporarily, in our non-enlightened condition, we desire to have happiness. So we have these two objectives. And sometimes there's a notion that enlightenment is something transcendent and completely otherworldly, and our present happiness, just in our everyday situation, that's something completely different. But actually, and this is going to be really the point in terms of identifying the nature of desire, is that working with desire, working with our conditions, working with who we are, these two actually don't really contradict. Us working for our relative happiness in our non-enlightened life actually presumes the very same things that enlightenment does. We're not going to be happy as long as we're clinging on to destructive patterns such as desire. And so for us to be happy even presently, we need to create the conditions for that. And it's incidentally also the same conditions for enlightenment. We're basically about raising ourselves. We are upping our ante. And as unenlightened persons on the path, in pursuing the conditions for happiness, we're also pursuing the conditions for enlightenment. Of course, we very often come across sort of in certain Buddhist neighborhood where we would say, oh yeah, well, as long as it's virtue, it's still just a golden cage. And as long as we're not enlightened, everything else in the relative truth is insignificant. And that's not really the case. Creating the conditions for happiness and increasing degrees of sanity, even within a samsaric condition, is also what brings us closer to awakening. So people who pursue then the conditions of the you could say increasingly less confused condition, and who succeed in doing so, what we call aryas or pakpas in Tibetan, and that means that they're elevated, they're sublime persons. And so these persons then, very often we talk about sublime beings in terms of those who have entered profound levels of the path. But of course, it also applies to us that we presently, with the application of the teaching, we're also eliminating the causes for confusion and, you can say, raising ourselves. This is absolutely necessary. So without this kind of vision for ourselves, there's not really any path, and we remain ordinary. It's not just that we, it's either we're enlightened or we're not. We're continually having to work with challenges within our own lives, and this kind of vision of where we're heading is what's basic to the path. And it's absolutely essential. Otherwise, we're just going to be circling within the same habitual patterns. So we need to apply this effort, which really involves then looking at ourselves, working with ourselves, wishing self-improvement. And it's through doing that, being proactive in such a process, that we extract ourselves from our confusion and also from suffering. Now, there's something that obviously gets in the way, and this is the basic condition of our self-centering, which has a particular mode of operation, which is centered on an insecurity that continually operates with like and dislike. And when we have like and dislike, that then continually increases these conditions, these afflicted conditions, where the mind is then getting what it wants, and then possibly there's a degree of self-absorption and self-infatuation, or not getting what it wants, frustration, anger, jealousy, and so forth. And in this way, the mind is continually operating within a toxic condition. And that's where the mind's original condition, which is not this kind of confused operation, it loses its natural freshness and its natural openness, its natural purity. And that's where the mind is corrupted by what we call the emotional conflicts or kleshas. We sometimes refer to these sometimes as emotions, sometimes as neurosis, sometimes as afflictions and so forth. But it's this toxic condition that veils the natural purity of the mind. And so the kleshas can be understood as, and we within our life, we can experience this, of course, excessive desire, anger, jealousy, envy, pride, excessive egocentricity, and so on. And Traleg Rinpoche uses this interesting term, which is excessive, because you could say, of course, desire could arise, but we might not fixate on it. We might not perpetuate it. And that's why we could say desire needn't necessarily be that much of a problem if we know how to operate with it. But in the condition of the kleshas, in the conditions of these afflicted states, of toxic states, then desire has gained traction. Anger has gained traction, jealousy has gained traction, and so forth. So that's where they then constitute conditions that are, you could say, aggravated, afflicted. Now, when we engage on the basis of these toxic conditions, when we begin to engage these, say, with our body, with our speech and our mind, and they begin to be part of us, this then leaves imprint in our consciousness. And that then again shapes our behavior. This becomes part of who we are. That's where we begin to construct, you could say, our particular style as a samsaric being. And that's what we call karma. The actual patterns themselves we refer to as vasanas. If you look in Traleg Kyabgon's book Karma, then he talks a great deal about these habitual patterns that are left as imprints in the all ground. But the imprints, these are then, when we act on them and they become part of what we are, these are then what becomes karma. And all of these, they come about due to us essentially fixating on the basis of our self-centering. We fixate on what arises in the mind. And also there's something very interesting that I very much appreciate in Traleg Kyabgon's teaching. He makes the point that once we are caught in these patterns, then what we do becomes increasingly predictable. Of course, what happens is we become fixed. We can be fixed in terms of our obsessions of desire. It can be fixed in terms of our rigidity and anger. But once we have that, and we are held by that, how we act becomes very predictable. There's a very predictable script. And that's interesting because whereas if we are less held by these, and if we're, you could say, practitioners, and even though we are not perfect, or even though we're not necessarily Aryas yet, or Pakpas, then nevertheless, there's a greater degree of freedom. And that's the quality of the virtuous mind, that's less held by the kleshas. So the less neurotic mind, the increasingly virtuous mind, is also increasingly free, increasingly spontaneous, whereas the mind that's held by the kleshas is very predictable. So that's again coming back to there's a big difference in terms of the freedom we experience if we're in tune with a virtuous frame of mind, or if we're caught up in a sort of rigid, predictable patterns. So understanding this situation, then what we are intending to do then with the path is to lift ourselves from this, what Traleg Kyabgon calls this degradation. And this requires that we do something, and that's premised not just on our actions. We could be very good Buddhists and do all the right things, but really what really matters is what's behind the grasping and the fixation. We're going to be looking at that grasping and fixation actually reflect two different degrees of subtlety. Grasping is on a more behavior level, and fixation is more subtle. But anyway, we can recognize the need to extract ourselves from this kind of degradation, simply just observing what happens with ourselves or with others when we pursue ordinary desire, let's say money, that generally only increases our desire. So if we give in to the need for I need more money, then it doesn't really leave us satisfied. And similar also if we give into anger, if we give into jealousy, if we give into greed and so forth, it doesn't really, it's not as if we gain satisfaction. It's something that just increases it. We traditionally refer to this as drinking, or compare it with drinking salt water. So we need to be aware of. That's why we need to be attentive, apply introspection, and identify these tendencies, what we call grasping and the fixation, to actually get to the bottom of these kleshas that essentially destroy our well-being. Traleg Kyabgon says, grasping comes from not knowing how to handle our emotional responses and experiences. Fixation, on the other hand, has a conceptual or intellectual component that comes from holding on to certain kinds of beliefs within a conceptual framework. Thus, grasping and fixation are seen as being connected to the management of excessive or unbridled desire. So, you say we'll be looking at that, but grasping is more about the things where we say, okay, I should really be less held by my desire, I should be less held by my anger. But then again, that can become very moralistic, and that's where, to go beyond that, actually, we need also to get free of the basic the basic attitudes that actually lie behind that. And that's where we very often, when we are moralistic persons, we are persons who rise above our, you could say, base instincts. And that's, of course, admirable, but the base instincts are still there. And then being free of the base instincts also could become a little bit of having a reference point, or a little bit of sense of a dualistic sense of a new addiction, us being virtuous persons. And that's where getting to the bottom of that is where we need to also address the entire notion of fixation. And that requires meditation. The first one is more about our behavior. The second one is more subtle, and as we should see, that that requires the practice of meditation. Okay, yeah, good. Okay, we also have a backup, somebody out there doing the recording. Thank you. Desire that uplifts and desire that degrades. So one might think, and this very often is sort of part of the intellectual sort of intellectual discussion around Buddhist notions of enlightenment. And that's where there might be the notion of saying, well, you know, I'm just going to be what I am. Enlightenment itself is the desireless state, and there shouldn't be any kind of ambition, there shouldn't be any desire. So there might be some people who would perceive this kind of paradox in desiring the desireless state of enlightenment. That might actually not make sense. What are these Buddhists doing? If they want enlightenment, why don't you just accept what they are? Why are they so busy? But the thing is, there's desire and desire, and there's not all kinds of desire that degrade us. And this kind of desire on the path is not one that's, how do you say, informed by or fueled by ambition. And hence, this kind of not all desires are to be eliminated. Some assist us. The desire to benefit others, the desire to create happiness in others, the desire for enlightenment, and so on. So we distinguish between desire that binds us and those that free us. Obviously, there's the desire, like we saw before, with money and so on, that binds us. The desire for enlightenment, yes, that's about freeing us. So desire that leads to craving, grasping, fixation, and clinging. And then there's the desire that doesn't. So some forms of desire then clearly lead to contentment, satisfaction, and fulfillment. And without any desire, yeah, if we were to sort of have this sort of, you could say, inanimate, lifeless condition of no impulse, then we could say we'd have no life force, we'd have no meaning. And certainly what keeps us alive is this quality of engagement with the world. And so this quality of desire then is this that enables us to operate from the point of view of something needs to be done. I'm here, I'm experiencing this, and I'd like to create the conditions for happiness and freedom. So that's where we practice the path. To practice the path, we need this desire to progress. The other condition then being completely apathetic, not just not wanting anything, that's not really what we would understand as enlightenment at all. And sometimes also then we have this notion nowadays that very often is like we just need to accept who we are. And that's true. We definitely should accept who we are, but at the same time also we need to accept who we are. That's a fact where we are, but we also need to recognize that something needs to be done about what we're doing. So that kind of ultimate notion of not doing anything, that doesn't really apply in terms of us being presently sentient beings. Without any kind of desire then towards enlightenment, we would just be stuck in an ordinary condition and we'd continue to suffer. When we're practicing the path and we have aspiration And there's a lot of emphasis on this on the path, basically because we're constructing ourselves in terms of where we're heading. We're informing our future through our aspirations, through our motivations. And in fact, what we're doing is aligning ourselves with our innate nature through doing that. And that's where we speak about then the nature this brings vigor and energy. And this is again where desire is something that fuels the progress on the path. The negative, destructive desire, the kleshas and our addiction and fixation on them, this is overcome with the desire then of positive motivation and the practice of the path. Traleg Kyabgon says meaning uncontrolled desire is not controlled, not managed, it can manifest as very destructive. But on that account, we should not then conclude that we have to overcome desire altogether. So in general, the notion of desire is possibly in a spiritual context seen as something destructive, but that's not really the case. That's what the point that's being made here. So the theory of desirelessness. So we have many spiritual traditions that claim desire needs to be replaced with desirelessness. And that's true in the sense of genuinely being without any personal agenda, self-centered agenda. But at the same time, we still need to do something. And that's all very often where the intellectual sort of delving into spirituality and pondering spiritual themes can get very confused, where you then sort of read these things about desirelessness and then you just think, oh, well, I'm just going to let everything be. It's true, enlightenment in itself is without any desireless quality. But then again, presently where we are, again, with an acceptance of where we are, there has to be this desire to uplift ourselves, to extract ourselves from our condition. So to do that, we overcome destructive habitual patterns by developing a motivation that goes counter to them. This is where we're, in terms of the path, then we're continually generating this attitude and these aspirations that go beyond the ordinary self-centered agendas. So to do that, this requires then that we have these qualities that are reflections of desire, namely determination, willpower, and so forth. So clearly, then desire is required for us to progress. So strengthening desire to overcome bad habits. So we all have sort of a vague notion that change needs to be done, right? And sort of people have New Year's resolutions and so forth. But they're very often seen as being powerless. And this is because we very often just have a very vague notion of wishing to change. We just sort of have some notion that something needs to, I'm going to change somehow. But there's not really, we don't really have the education, we don't really have the framework, we don't really have the methods and so forth. So this is where we need much more than just this sort of superficial inspiration. And this is where, when we work with what needs to be changed, we need to harness, we need to be clear on this positive desire in order to overcome or overpower negative desire. This is not really a question of battling, but it's more actually beginning to invest more attention in one place and being less fixated. Very often we're sort of overcome by guilt and depression about our lack of qualities, and we might fixate on the half-empty glass of negative desire, and this leads us to be quite powerless. Whereas if we are more attentive to the attractive qualities of working with positive desire, then this gives a lot of strength. So this kind of positive desire, it doesn't necessarily lead to fixation. This is what we were saying before. It leads to a lot more spontaneity. It leads to a lot more freedom. The thing is, we begin to see things, and this is actually referring, this is my interpretation, but this is referring to the dependent origination or the dependent nature of everything. With positive desire, we see the dynamic nature of things. This is something that sometimes is a bit irritating with the Buddhist teaching, is that actually any situation is seen as workable, because nothing is seen as being fixed or stuck and being one way or another. Everything is seen as, you could say, a web of causes and conditions. And that's where, when we have positive desire, when we have insight, then we begin to see how actually things, they're not really stuck in one particular way. They can be worked with. Whereas, and this comes from a wider perspective, whereas when we're caught in fixation, we tend to be more narrow-minded, and we tend to be more caught up in rigid perceptions, and that's where we miss the dynamic quality of phenomena. That's where we see things as just stuck in one way or another. So when we're fixated, let's say we're caught in desire, then we miss the opportunity for transforming these emotions. And that's where we're not really seeing the mind as innately bad, but we're just seeing how we, due to our particular optics, we fail to see the workable nature of our mind. And that's what happens when we are fixated on the kleshas. So much of the path is really premised on us developing a determination. We can't attend the teaching and just says, oh, now I heard the teaching. It actually requires that we hear the teaching, and out of that comes this intention to develop a resolve. And that's where we graduate from just being people who are, how do you say, theorists or intellectuals, into being practitioners. So that's where we develop this determination. And that's the nature of positive desire. And that's where then, as practitioners, we can begin to transform even negative states of mind. This doesn't mean we won't have negative states of mind. As practitioners, we will have as many negative states of mind as before. In fact, not only will we have as many negative states of mind as before, but we'll also, what we didn't have before, we'll be painfully aware of these states of mind. But the good news is we'll have the ability to transform them. And this is, again, coming back to this determination of positive desire. Merely by our aspiration, by our wish to actually do something about it. Then we're not constructing ourselves in terms of what we have been perpetuating in terms of negative desire. We'll be constructing ourselves in what we presently are doing in terms of us developing positive desire. Traleg Kyabgon says, what we are aiming for in Buddhism, rather than the extinguishing of all desires, is to learn to overcome the negative forms. We're looking at the purification of desires rather than the abandonment of all desire. The process of abandonment and that of purification are completely different. Buddhist practice, which involves overcoming clinging, grasping, and fixation, is designed to aid in the process of purifying our desires. It's not there to make us abandon desire altogether, because, as previously stated, if there were no desire at all, we would have no will and determination. So little, if anything, would be accomplished. So that, again, is where we celebrate that we have this living quality of desire. It just needs to be put in the right direction. With the path, we overcome tanha, which is Sanskrit for thirst or craving. Otherwise, the desire that we have is endless. So we overcome tanha, this thirst or craving. Otherwise, the desire that we normally have, which is, this is what I want, this is what I like, this is what I want, and we go for it, where we then actually don't get satisfaction, this is like drinking salt water, which famously, if you're thirsty and you drink salt water, you're not going to quench your thirst, you're going to become increasingly thirsty. So dealing with desire properly, on the other hand, brings satisfaction and fulfillment. So the impetus or the motivation for doing so is that it's something that's going to, dealing with desire properly is not going to just be cutting off anything, but it's going to give us joy and satisfaction, fulfillment. Whereas on the other hand, negative desire by nature actually cannot be satisfied. This is where we need to be quite clear that these two ways of handling desire have very different outcomes. So without grasping, we can enjoy objects without it bringing about tanha or thirst. So the sage is not fixated or obsessed with anything in particular, but might very well enjoy some things without necessarily being attached to it. So the relinquishing of negative desire doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're also relinquishing particular objects. It doesn't really have anything to do with this kind of behavior aspect. It's just, and in fact, it enables us to actually more fully then enjoy the objects. So the point is that it's not the object of desire that traps us. It's our response to these things. And there's a famous quote from Tilopa, who said to Naropa, "You're not bound by the object. You're bound by your shenpa. Cut your shenpa, Naropa." Now, shenpa means attachment. I translated it using a word that a Tibetan word that Pema Chodron very often uses in her teaching, and it just means our grasping onto things. We stubbornly grasp onto things, and that's Tilopa's point is to his student is that Naropa, he needn't worry about the object. That's not the problem. It's the attachment to the objects that's the problem. So disengaging is not at all the solution. In Buddhism, we dissolve this shenpa, this attachment, through meditation. Meditation enables the stable peace of mind. Now, this is important because we're brought up in a culture where we so often think in terms of behavior. What should I do? And then if I'm not going to be attached, that's about, okay, I won't act attached. But that's actually not going to really do more than, yes, it'll limit some of the catastrophes for sure, but it's essentially operating within a framework of a moralism. It's us telling ourselves, I shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do this, whatever. It's, you could say, it's a competing discourse within our mind where the mind is telling the mind what to do. And it's potentially quite explosive, because there could be conflict. What diffuses this conflict is the practice of meditation, because that's where we cease to be fascinated by what arises in the mind. And that's where there could be a peace of mind or stable peace, in the sense that there's not conflict in the mind. We're not fighting. And that's where we gain the lubrication, actually, where not only are we free from the impulses, but we're also not beginning to think of ourselves in terms of a particular moralistic person. We're just actually not getting caught up in the impulses that arise in the mind. And so that is where the fixation then is remedied. So that's where not only are we getting free of particular patterns, but we're also getting free of the mind that even thinks of itself in terms of battling particular patterns. We very often have this, if someone's over something, or the moralistic person has this subtle notion of pride in terms of their particular discipline or their particular, you could say, moral strength. And that actually is still held by this shenpa. The potential for the problem is still there. And so that's where we need then to get to the bottom of the fixation. And that is what we do with the practice of meditation. Again, desiring desirelessness is not a paradox. Desiring to be free of a certain craving will end the desire. So us working towards desirelessness is completely normal. That's what we need to do. So that's not necessarily something that's how do you say, contradictory. But again, like we said, we distinguish between two kinds of desires, the degrading and positive kind. And we do so through seeing whether or not um, is there the grasping that befuddles the mind. Yeah, we check, is there this grasping attitude. This is again something that comes back to our introspection and verifying what is happening in the mind. Traleg Kyabgon says the main criterion for distinguishing whether a desire is uplifting and positive or degrading and negative is whether there is an intense craving, grasping quality to it or not. From a Buddhist point of view, when there is a lot of grasping, clinging, and fixation involved in our desires, that befuddles our minds somewhat. We start to fantasize and fabricate things. The basic criterion for whether we are getting too caught up in our experience, whatever it might be, depends on how it is exaggerated in the mind and the degree of stabilizing it creates. So, of course, in the monastic setting, then there's a particular culture of being free of objects that could cause this kind of desire. Whereas we, as lay people, most of us here being lay people, and certainly even if we are ordained persons, we live in a culture where there's we're continually being sold all sorts of desirable experiences. That's where we can look, how much am I actually involved in this grasping, and that's where we then we can see whether or not, on the basis of whether or not whether or not there is this negative grasping, on the basis of just checking what are we doing in terms of our own mind. So we have these terms, need, want, and desire. So defining them, we could say needs are the essentials we have for our life. You know, if you look at, was it Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Maslow's pyramid, you know, there's the, you know, the physical needs, you know, our food, our livelihood, and then sort of increasingly more and more subtle needs. But regardless, we need these. So they are not necessarily tied up with something that has to do with desire as such. Whereas what we then call wants and desires, that's something where we can modify. That's where we can say, okay, my desire and my want and so forth, that's not necessarily the same as what I need. So we train ourselves in just wanting what we need, and we train ourselves in not wanting what we don't need. I remember Traleg Kyabgon once said to a friend of mine, do what you want to do and don't do what you don't want to do. And that sounds so simple, but it's actually not that easy. And training ourselves in just wanting what we need and training ourselves in not wanting what we don't need is actually quite challenging. We can try it for ourselves. Traleg Kyabgon says, learning to distinguish the things that are good for us and learning not to want the things that are bad for us is key. Related to the categories of what we find desirable and what we do not find desirable is learning not to want certain things, even if they are desirable, and learning how to want something even if it is not desirable. So basically, we're going to have to make sacrifices sometimes, and that actually works beautifully. And sometimes we're going to have to just cope with conditions, and it works beautifully. What we want and find desirable can change depending on our attitude. So we can also see with changing our prioritizing and our choices, then what actually is desirable for us very often changes our lifestyle, our value systems, and so forth. So it's nothing about their needs necessarily, it's just about us changing our attitude. So the same experience, but handled differently, brings a different result. So we could walk into a situation where we normally, habitually would want something, desire something, and react in a way. If we don't get what we want, we could be very negative. Whereas if we walk into the same situation without the same degree of desire, we could have a very different and very often much more constructive result. So this is not about having or not having an experience or a habit, right? Sometimes we think, oh, if only this didn't happen to me, if only, I was like that. And sometimes we think, oh, this person doesn't have these kind of experiences. This person is so lucky because this person doesn't have these kind of inclinations or desires or whatever. That's not at all about it. What we're talking about here is about us beginning to work with what we have. And as long as we're sentient beings and we have kleshas, as long as we have dualistic fixation, we're going to have strong habits that come from that. So it's not about us all of a sudden thinking that we should be in a different way. We are what we are, but what we're doing is we're beginning to eliminate what brings us down, what degrades us. And that's where we are working with this constant erosion of strong habits. Now, and this is quite important actually. This is achieved through building strong willpower to weaken the habit. Now, this is not about a conflict really, but it's about one thing becoming stronger and naturally as a result the other becoming weaker. You could think of it as sort of as a sliding scale where one is on the increase, the other correspondingly is on the decrease. Traleg Kyabgon says, overcoming a bad habit is not about us having that experience arise anymore. That is not generally how habits are overcome. Bad habits are overcome through constant erosion of that deep-seated habit pattern. So the hold it has on us becomes less and less. It is not about still having or not having certain habit patterns. It is about changing the combination of the strong habit and weak will to build stronger willpower to assist in weakening the effect a bad habit has on our well-being. So we need to humbly acknowledge that if we have a strong habit, it's because we've let it evolve in a particular way, and that's where we've been weak. And that's where we need to allow the willpower to gain strength. It's not necessarily about us beginning to battle the particular habit pattern, but as long as we're beginning to build this willpower and just looking on the positive side, the half full glass, then naturally then this weakens the bad habit. So Traleg Kyabgon's point really is in this methodology here, as far as I sort of can see, is that first we recognize that a bad habit has a hold on us and that our willpower is weak. Okay, that's a humble recognition. That needs to be quite clear to us. Then, and that's as practitioners on the path, we build willpower that equals the habit. So we have a strong habit, but then we build, and that's where we develop the determination, we have discipline, we have the sort of wider perspective, we have a strength of mind, bodhicitta, and so forth. And that's where we build this willpower that then equals the habit. And eventually then the willpower overpowers the habit. So at that point, we're not even particularly thinking of in terms of fighting the habit. It naturally just is weak and doesn't really constitute a threat anymore. So this process is basic to us eroding strong habits, but it requires developing non-grasping and non-clinging, and that again is where we require the practice of meditation. These habits, there's not something that we can just stop all of a sudden. We need to be aware of them. And very often if you join a spiritual path, then you think, oh, now I'm part of this spiritual culture. I identify with all its values. I don't have any more bad habits. And that's very sweet. And that's sort of a little bit of honeymoon attitude where, you identify strongly with the value system of your path, but it's actually really just something that sits on the surface. And then when we become more jaded and we're sort of over the novelty and we see that we still have the bad habits, then we might give up. We'll think, oh, I need to do something else. I'd rather have a different path. I'm going to do something else. But that's really just not having worked with what we are. And we have to be realistic. These bad habits, they require work. They take time. So the first thing is that we see how grasping and fixation leads to more wanting. We see that in our own process, how we grasp onto things, how we have underlying assumptions. And we also are motivated by seeing that our pursuing particular desires, it doesn't necessarily work. We fail, and our failure is not necessarily that we're defined in terms of our failure. It's more that clearly we're innocently gone down the wrong track, but something can be done, and that's where we then relinquish the cause of the problem, which is the clinging and the grasping. But, and again, this point about fixation, without overcoming fixation, these antidotes can become another obsession. We can become very virtuous and very sort of free, but then again, we develop a whole new set of credentials on the basis of that new identity. And that's where we need then to also be free of the underlying self-congratulations and subtle clinging, which is then what we call fixation. And again, this is what requires the practice of meditation. This process will not necessarily lead to immediate success, and so yes, obviously, and we need to begin by understanding the dynamics involved, and this is where we need to look at our own mind, what's happening. We need to see through introspection what's happening. So then gradually the desire to stop overcomes the habit. Okay. So we build good habits, so there's a question here. So we build good habits through strengthening willpower to the degree where we also are increasingly open to experiences in life without hooking in. Yeah, that's it, yes. Yeah, as long as we know what's going on, that's the thing. We can't really say, oh yeah, now I'm going to engage with in various things without limiting myself or cutting myself off. And I'm just not going to be attached. It's so much about seeing what is really happening within ourselves. Is the approach non-grasping and non-clinging to a sense of fixed self and ego particularly? Is the approach of non-grasping and non-clinging to a sense of fixed self and ego particularly, rather than to notion of desire to pull it out of the root? Well, there are different degrees, and that's where the sort of the general sense of ego is the non-grasping and non-clinging, and yeah, but to really get to the root of it is to get to the root of fixation. So that's where we sort of go to a more subtle aspect of that. Yeah. So meditation, thoughts, and willpower. Now, some people will think that having no thoughts or less thoughts is not what defines. They think that that is meditation, but that's not it. Having less thoughts is not really meditation. However, when we recognize thoughts, they have less power. This is part of meditation. That comes with us beginning to be more cultivating an awareness of what's happening in the mind. And that's where, with the increasing of awareness in the mind, then also thoughts have less power. It's not like we're actually reducing the power of the thoughts. It's just that we're beginning to have more awareness. So meditation is not about no thoughts. Rather, it's about being mindful. So like Tongsa Khyentse Rinpoche says, the problem is distraction, and hence the solution is mindfulness. So the goal of meditation is not trance, even though it happens. Some traditions, there's a lot of emphasis on going into these jhanas or deep trances, and conditions, and to some extent that's quite valuable in terms of shifting our mind, but at the same time, that's not really the goal of meditation. So Traleg Kyabgon says, in Buddhism, the goal of meditation is to stabilize the mind. If we can stabilize the mind, we're having successful meditation. we stabilize mind with the practice of mindfulness. So that means that incessant thoughts are not a worry. We should direct our energy and willpower into mindfulness. So we're going to have thoughts. That's not really a problem. But we shouldn't sit there and try to think, I shouldn't have thoughts. It's more about us sustaining mindfulness. And we can put then our determination towards sustaining mindfulness. So that means when we wander, didn't mean we come back when we wander. We practice non-forgetfulness. That's basically what we're doing with the practice of meditation. We're becoming present. So with mindfulness, we have a remedy for the more subtle nature of fixation, because that's where we are really working with the undercurrent or the undertow of the subtle attitudes that are happening in the mind. And we're beginning to not really be too worried about these, or rather we're not giving them authority, and we're also seeing them. So that's where we are less held by these attitudes of fixation. Traleg says non-fixation is harder to practice than non-grasping and non-clinging because it's subtler. Fixation is a more subtle form of grasping. In Buddhism, fixation, just for good measure, has an intellectual component. It's more discursive or more cognitive in nature. So this refers to these, you could say, underlying attitudes that informs our attitudes and actions. Yeah. And then there's a question: could it be said that trance mind might be a form of mental fixation? Yeah, that is what it is. It can be quite helpful in terms of it actually identifying you could say, the role of the mind and the primacy of mind and the importance of mind. But at the same time, it is also about holding the mind, and it could very well be that we become addicted to this kind of trance-like condition. Okay, chapter 2, apprehending the world through our senses. So what we're looking at here is understanding more what's going on with ourselves. And the moment that we see that we're constructed through causes and conditions, we don't think of ourselves in just being one way or another. And that's why it's so important in the Buddhist teaching to study dependent arising, the 12 links, and so forth. And that is a big part of the study of the Abhidharma. So we'll be looking at that later in this book. But this is what enables us to understand then desire. And desire, we can say, comes from contact. And it's on the basis of contact that we then have feelings of pain and pleasure. And on the basis of that, then we have craving or clinging, and then we have grasping. So these are some of the links in the 12 links of dependent arising. Now, what we then have is essentially two kinds of attitude. Once we have this experience, I like this, I want to hold on to that, and so forth. This brings when we experience something we don't like, this brings aversion. And when we have something we like, this brings attachment. It's very simple. This is not rocket science, but it is what underlies and informs all the time our choices. So when we talk about grasping, clinging, fixation, this is not just about things that we like. This is more about the patterns that we begin to establish in terms of likes and dislike. So the grasping and the clinging is something that is certainly taking place with attachment, but it also takes place with aversion. Traleg TKI, by the way, is Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche. So he says, grasping and clinging arises in so many different contexts, in so many different ways, not just in terms of attraction and aversion. It arises even in terms of what we think about, what we believe in, how we believe in the reality of things, how we conceptualize about ourselves and the world, and how we develop certain convictions and fixate on them. We can become totally attached to our cherished belief systems, and notion of things, of how things are. Yeah, about trance. I'm thinking about trance and its importance in certain cultures, like in Bali. Yeah, well, things like trance is that it creates incredibly powerful states of mind. So persons who go into trance, they very often see things that ordinary people don't see, and also are able to do things that ordinary people don't do, and so forth. But they are essentially ways of fixating the mind. So they're not really what we in Buddhism regard as um, they're not really part of the path, what necessarily brings about liberation. In fact, they can bring about a lot of further fixation. The meaning of wrong view, right view, and transcending view. So when we talk about view, we mean what it is that actually informs how we see the world. It informs our perspective. So here this means in terms of, for us presently, and what we're looking at here, is actually looking at what is constructive and what is destructive in terms of desire. So doing that, then we discern the impact of grasping and fixation versus the impact of letting go. Our view is informed by the perspective that sees this is going to work in terms of us being free, and this is going to bind us, keep us held. So that's what the view provides. And grasping and clinging, which we have all the time, that mingles with any negative form of desire. So us and our kleshas and so forth engage, and we sort of get together and we fixate on these, and that's hold on to them, grasp and so forth, various kinds of desire. Desire can also be us insisting, I'm going to be angry. So desire here basically means this sort of wish to sometimes we have this like, hey, I'm a angry person, or I have a right to be angry or whatever. And so that's also a negative form of desire, and that comes from this clinging and grasping. So liberation lies in freedom from grasping, clinging, and fixation. We can see that reflected in the lives of great masters, great men and women who are free. We can see how they don't have grasping, clinging, and fixation. It's not that their life is different or even that they have different circumstances necessarily, but it's exactly this little thing, this lack of grasping, clinging, and fixation, that's absence, that defines them this remarkable quality that is their freedom, that is their liberation. And so we could say enlightened qualities are defined by the absence of these grasping, clinging, and fixation. All the things that we rejoice in, find wonderful, they come from the absence of this. So talking about non-grasping, non-clinging, and non-attachment, grasping leads to negative emotions and suffering. Without graspings, emotions need not be negative or painful. We can have the arisings of emotions, but without grasping, we might not necessarily go down a destructive path. So these three, non-grasping, non-clinging, non-attachment, does not mean anything in terms of how we remove ourselves. It does not mean that we remove ourselves from the world. Like I was saying, the sage, the practitioners and so forth, they're not necessarily living in a different universe. They very much are present within our world. And so us as practitioners, we don't really have the option also to remove ourselves from the world. But we needn't actually, and that's not the implication really in what we're talking about here. In fact, the reality is that we can engage with the world more fully when we have a non-grasping attitude. We touch more lightly, we see more clearly, we take off our sort of shades of particular attitudes that are shaped by our grasping and clinging and attachment, and we experience reality more fully. So without these these kind of these clingings of various kinds, then we see things as they are. This is very often something that we come across in the Buddhist teaching, seeing things as they are. Songsa Khyentse very often talks about seeing the truth. And what we're talking about is this things as they are without our veiling over them or not seeing them for what they are. In Tibetan, the word nelu means the way things actually is, the abiding nature of something. So that's Traleg Kyabgon refers to this term. So rather than seeing the world, what happens is we tend to create narratives about the world. So we put on our shades of our particular grasping and fixation, and then we're seeing the world according to our particular version of it. So this version has little to do with the world, and it is what causes our disturbances. We're continually running into conflict because our version of the world is not in concordance with the way that the world is. So, in fact, we might think that we're engaging with the world, but we're not. We might think that the sage is somebody who lives in an otherworldly dimension, but actually no, the sage is actually in the world. We're the ones who are not in the world. So with our particular optics of desire and clinging, then we're not interacting with the world. We're living our own self-created drama. We have our own little private, samsara going. Traleg Kyabgon says, this then develops as a complete personal reality in our heads. And this fabricated world is what we call samsara. And understanding the ramifications of samsara, the suffering that goes with it, we see that there is a need to recognize clinging and grasping and training, letting go of these. Yeah. So we need to see we're doing this and we need to let go of it. Is there a difference between grasping and clinging? I think for the time being, what we're talking about is the grasping is that we perceive something and we like it, and then clinging is holding on to it. Yeah. But they're very sort of synonymous, and in general they're sort of coupled together. But yes, they are. You could say the basic grasping, and that's what we're training in relinquishing. But that's very much on the level of behavior. And so clinging and grasping, you could say, is in the department of the way that we hold on to things, also mentally. But fixating is then even more basic than that, where we then have attitudes that inform what we want to cling to or what we want to grasp. A life of clinging and fixation is futile for ourselves and others. We're not really having a proper life. We're having a half life, and also in having this kind of life, we're not really fulfilling ourselves, and we certainly aren't able to do much for others. So when we're talking about desirelessness, it's not at all disengaging from the world. We could say the samsaric experience of clinging and fixation, that is the disengaged state. So you could say the Buddhas, they're the ones who are engaging with the world. Sentient beings are not engaging with the world. Now, the problem for sentient beings is why they're not engaging with the world, because they're not seeing the world for what it is. And what is preventing us from seeing the world for what it is two veils, which we call klesha varana, and this is the veil of conflicting emotions. This is the kleshas, the attachment, aversion, pride, jealousy, and ignorance. And then it's what we call nyaya varana, the veil of conceptual confusion, or sometimes also called cognitive obscuration. And that's the very core or basis of samsara. It's the very dualistic fixation. So that's the very ground. Right now, we're generally talking about the level of the conflicting emotions, but also with fixation, we're also heading in the direction of this more subtle veil of the conceptual confusion. So when we remove these two, we see reality and we flourish. Then, like Traleg Kyabgon says, only then are we truly worldly people, in the sense we're actually beginning to relate to reality. Other than that, we're, like he was saying, we're just caught in our own private version of the world. And when we remove this, this is then what we call seeing reality and flourishing, which is actually the Tibetan etymology for the word Buddha, which is Sangye, which means Sang means removing what obscures, and Gye means flourishing. So the Buddha is somebody who's truly living in reality. Sentient beings are just living in a shadow version of reality. So to actually engage the world, we need to penetrate these two veils. So the two veils bring about fixation, which constructs our version of self, others, and the world. So once we are a sentient being and we're caught by these two veils, initially the basic duality, the basic notion of this and that, self and other, and so forth, the basic confusion, and then based on this self-centered experience, then we have the afflictions, liking this, not liking that, building narratives and so forth, like we have it with when we develop the 5 skandhas. On the basis of these two veils, then we have then the entire experience of ourselves, we have the experience of others, and we have the experience then of the world. So that's where the problem is not the desire as such, which is just something that arises in our mind, but it's the fixation. The moment that we begin to believe in our thinking, then that we have this excessive desire where it becomes toxic. There is a need, we need to put restraint in place, otherwise we suffer and we lack contentment. So there's a place where we need to see that something needs to be done. We practice the path, we exercise some kind of discipline, whatever our path prescribes. But the path remedies then this condition of toxic desire. Now there's a little bit of the implication here, sorry. Yeah, okay. We need to put a restraint in place. Yeah, otherwise we suffer and lack contentment. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So the bottom line is, if we practice the path, we're going to have contentment, we're going to have happiness. If we don't, then we're going to suffer accordingly. And once we have that frustration and bitterness and, you could say, sad state of mind where we're not happy with what we have, this then leads to a very bleak and negative view on the world in general. And that's where we then have this cynical outlook, and also without a corresponding sense of life is meaningless, the universe is meaningless, and so forth. This happens within ourselves. It's also very much often fed by a particular cultural discourse. But this is one that very much operates within a lack of vision of what really our life is and what's the potential of life. When there's no vision and there's no sense of implementing or having a path that can enable us to see reality for what it is, when there's no method for actually seeing reality and we're stuck by our particular habitual patterns, and we're simply just perpetuating the same old, then the suffering that comes from that then leads to this kind of bleak outlook and sense of meaninglessness. And that's where people might even lose the desire to be alive. That's why people talk about killing time, or just not really having any particular joy in being alive. See, that's where it's quite helpful then to meditate on the impermanent nature of things, the impermanent nature of desire. If we're a Buddhist practitioner, Traleg Kyabgon says, and we don't master desire, this can lead to a sense of failure. So very often we might be Buddhist practitioners, but again, we're fooled by our senses and fooled by desire of various kinds. And that's why it's quite helpful to ponder the impermanence and the fact that things are not really going to last. And the way that we engage with things and would like to have them happen and be there forever is by nature not going to happen. So pondering that, this then needs to be, this is a remedy, an antidote in terms of our desire. So when we do that, we realize that it's due to our grasping that the desired objects lead to dissatisfaction. However, without grasping, we could fully engage with and enjoy the desired objects. So the key is not really about the objects, again, like we looked at before, but it's about having or not having grasping. In Buddhist monastics, they train in reducing attachment. You know, there's as part of the monastic attitude is very much about having less attachment of any kind. And when monastics, they apply this, then they emerge as better persons. Now, I sort of thought this was interesting, this phrasing, better persons, you know, with diligence, they come out as better persons. And that's actually why in traditional societies, Buddhist monks, or nuns, they are objects of veneration, because the implication is not that they've done something, they've renounced the world and they're not doing all the bad stuff we're doing. It's that they should actually emerge as better persons for the exact meaning that we actually read into this, right? They should become kinder, spacious, more open-minded, more relaxed persons. So everything that we associate with better persons, we understand is not really something that just happens randomly, that some people are, just nice people, but it's very much, the sort of what emerges as part of a process. Like Trungpa just says, the Buddha didn't come out of a lotus, he came out of a factory. And that is where the application of the antidote with diligence then transforms individuals. Traleg Kyabgon says, non-grasping, non-clinging, and non-fixation are connected to appreciation, openness, joy, and all the positive qualities associated with life. Non-grasping, non-clinging, and non-fixation, instead of leading to lack of appreciation of life, leads to the appreciation of life. Being clingy and grasping, we create our own dramas and pain. So it's on the basis of that that we end up suffering. We can't blame others for doing that. Like Traleg Kyabgon says, we don't need other people to cause us suffering. We're perfectly capable of doing that ourselves. So we learn how to not grasp through the practice of meditation. We do that in terms of our behavior, but also really what is the hallmark of the Buddhist methodology is the practice of meditation, the practice of actually cornering the mind. It's through doing that we learn to recognize and release grasping. We very often could recognize that we have grasping, but releasing it, that's a different matter, and that requires then the practice of meditation. So this is something that opens us, and through doing that enables us to appreciate others and the world. So us relinquishing our particular dramas and attachments and so forth is something that brings about our appreciation of the world and other persons. Traleg Kyabgon says, to reiterate, Buddhist meditation should not be seen as a way of withdrawing from the world. Rather, it is a way of allowing us to break out of our own internal world. We learn to step out of that and engage with the world in a direct and in a direct way. Sorry. In a direct and enriched way, so that Shila, ethical conduct can manifest within a more meditative, less grasping frame of mind. It's important to think of training ourselves to grasp and cling less. This is the best way to manage our desire and behave more ethically. By the way, apologies, some of you probably noticed there's a few typos in here. There was a word missing. So anyway, that happens. Traleg says, from a Buddhist point of view, there's nothing wrong with the world per se. What is wrong about our worldly experiences is the conflicting emotions that we experience and the conceptual confusions that we suffer from. These two aspects of our samsaric mind lead to clinging, grasping, and fixation. If we learn to have less grasping and so forth, everything that we experience about the world will be better. What is internal and what is external go together. They're not seen as entirely separate. From the Mahayana point of view, then, if we suffer a lot of frustration due to grasping and fixating, we're not in a good position to benefit or help others. So our perception of the external world has so much to do with the attitudes that are perceiving the world, right? So we distinguish positive desire from negative desire. Positive desire enables meaningful interaction. With no desire, there would be no interaction with the world. With no desire, we would not bother to improve on any level. So we're just making the point here that desire is something that we need. Desire is what's basic to us engaging with other people. So also without desire, we'd never ever be inclined to work on ourselves. And that's of course where we're not robots. We are animate, sentient, feeling creatures. And we have this Buddha nature that informs us that we're suffering and that this suffering is not desirable. And that's where we then have the desire to do something about it. Again, coming back to this, looking at the way that we do it, we needn't focus on the obstacle. We can focus on the desire for transformation. This is what we looked at earlier, right? So we're not focusing on what's wrong. We're rather focusing on the desire of engaging the antidote and the desire for transformation. So that desire then enables us to gain power and generate willpower. Traleg says, when you have strong desires, it's important for them to be carefully managed. When we really want something, it has its own power. It has the power to destroy us and also to uplift and enrich us. When that power is used positively, we can be transformed in a way that is of benefit to ourselves and others. When we desire the wrong way, very intensely, that can destroy us. And in that way, we cannot contribute positively in the world and work to benefit others. Okay. So that's I think the end of, no, there's one more. Okay. All right. So focusing on the will to change rather than the object of change gives power. Yeah, is that clear? I hope is that clear? Everyone in the class? Yeah, we're focusing on the impetus, that muscle, that attitude that wishes to change, rather than looking at the problem. And with a cultivating of that determination, then the focus is on that muscle, and that's where then there's a strength in that, and that's where there's no point really in looking at the object that needs to be changed. Yeah, this is where we gain our power. So just with people determined to overcome a physical challenge, Traleg gives the example of people who might be told that they might not be able to walk again, and they don't think, I'm not going to be able to walk again, damn, I want to walk. Rather, they think, I will walk. I shall walk. Yeah. So again, Traleg says, in Buddhism, it's important that we work to recognize and be clear about our shortcomings. It's important to be clear about what we need to overcome. Having secured that self-knowledge, then there is then no benefit in dwelling on our shortcomings, as that can diminish us. What we should be spending more time on is how to overcome our shortcomings to become a better person and have a better life experience, and further, to be in a position then to benefit others. Okay. So that concludes chapter 2, if I'm not wrong. Yes, to see if there's any questions. Okay. All right. I guess that's it, huh? Okay. I think we'll conclude class then. Yeah. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom. Thank you. So for the next time, please read the chapters 3 and 4, how reality challenges our subjective experience, and a wrong view and a right view to satisfy desire. Thank you very much.